Вітаю, колеги. Будемо починати.
Come, dear colleagues, so let us start.
Дякую вам, що ви
Thanks a lot
приєдналися до нашого
for
сьогоднішнього
joining
обговорення
us in
з
our today's
назвою,
discussion,
яка
which
нагадує мені
is
ще з дитинства.
which has a title that brings me
333,
back
але
to
потім
my childhood,
додався
like
незвичайні слова та їх фінансування, як
333. But then there come
узгодити питання.
some not children's
Мене
words,
звати
strategies.
Євгеній
So
Гліб, я виконавчий директор
333
Центру
strategies and their
комунікаційної
financing, how to
стратегії.
align Ukraine's budget
Я
with
сьогодні буду
long-term plans.
модерувати
I'm Huub
нашу
Bashlinsky.
подію.
I'm the executive director of the Center for Economic
Це
Strategies, and I'm going to be the facilitator of our
презентація,
today's event, where we will present
мої колеги
a research
зробили,
done
спираючись на
by my
ідею, яка
colleagues
виникла у нас
based on
в
the idea
обговоренні свого
that
часу
we
секретаріатом Кабінету
got
міністрів
during the
Міністерством економіки та
discussion
Міністерством
with the
фінансів. І,
Secretariat, with the Cabinet of
власне,
Ministers, with the
те,
Ministry of
що в
Economy and
цьому
Ministry of
обговоренні
Finance.
ми
And
тоді на що звертали
back
увагу,
then, in
скоро ми
that
маємо
discussion, we
кількісні
focused on a
виміри.
number of issues, and now
Станом на
we've got
серпень 25-го
quantitative
року в Україні
measurements
загалом є 333
for that.
чинних стратегічних
So all in all,
документи, але
as of
більшість з них
August
мають кілька
2025 in Ukraine, we've
фінансування, а
got
частина навіть
333
орієнтовних сум
strategies,
пов'язаних
but
з
most
бюджетом
of
необхідних
them
для
don't have
успішної
any
реалізації.
budget funding, and some of them even
Ця
don't have any
ситуація є
amounts coming from the budget to finance
неправильною.
them, which is the wrong
Ми в
situation.
межах нашого
And
дослідження
within our
подивилися на
research,
те,
we
як
focused on
практики власне
how
узгодження
the
стратегічного та бюджетного
practices of
планування
alignment of the
виглядають
strategic and budget planning
за
look like
загальноєвропейською моделлю
in the
Європейського Союзу,
European
як
model, in the
конкретно це
EU member
практично
states.
реалізовано в Польщі
We
та
had a look
Балтійських
at how
країнах,
this is
а також в Новій
implemented in
Зеландії,
Poland
що
and in the
вважається
Baltic
одним з
states, as
найкращих
well as in
прикладів
New Zealand, which is
подібних
considered to be one of the best examples
узгоджень.
of similar
Кілька
alignments.
технічних
Just a couple of technical issues that I need
речей.
to
По-перше, ми
mention.
хочемо
First of all,
подякувати
we would like to express our gratitude
платникам
to
податків Норвегії та Швеції,
taxpayers on Norway and
які,
Sweden,
власне, профінансували
because
фонд
it is
Askold
them
and
who have
Dir.
actually
Він
funded the Askold and Dir Fund, which
організації
is
ISAR
administered
Ednannia в межах
by the
проекту
ISAR
Фонду громадянського
Ednannia
суспільства
Ukraine
України, роки
within
реформ та
one of the
демократії.
project for Ukraine.
Є англійський переклад,
And
English
we do have
translation
English
is available, you
interpretation.
can switch
It's available and you
to
can
the
switch to the
conventional
English
English.
channel.
Запитання та коментарі
As far as
по
questions and comments are
презентації
concerned,
і до подальшого
regarding
обговорення
this presentation and as far as
найкраще
further
залишати
discussion is
в
concerned. So
Q&A, бо
let's leave
там
it
ми
for a Q&A
зможемо на
session, because
якісь
there we will be
особливо
able
дуже
to
технічні з них
focus on
відповісти
some
безпосередньо, а також
of them, and we will give
задати
direct
голосно.
answers to
Сьогодні
some
у
of
нас
them
такий
either
трохи
orally or in
незвичний
writing if
формат,
these are some technical issues.
хто
Today we have got quite an
часто
unusual
залучається до
format,
наших
because those of
заходів,
you who
зазвичай це
normally
формат,
participate in our
де
events know that
хтось один
normally that is the
робить
format when
презентацію
there is
або
just one
кілька
presenter,
колег з нашої
or
команди
there are
роблять
several
презентацію,
colleagues
потім
from
є
our
якесь велике
team
обговорення.
delivering a
Сьогодні у нас
presentation, and
троє
then there
колег,
comes a large
власне,
discussion.
будуть
But
презентувати наше
today we will have
дослідження, і
three
у нас буде
presenters of
в
our
такому
research,
майже
and
академічному
we will
стилі один
also have in
рецензент,
almost an
це Огі
academic
Сікс,
style one
наш
reviewer, which is Ogi Six,
давній партнер, керівник
our
проекту Європейського Союзу
partner,
по
head
прийняття
of the
комплексної
EU
реформи
project
державного
support
управління
of
в
the
Україні
comprehensive
ЄФОПАР.
reform of public governance in
З
Ukraine,
цифрою
which is
2
EU
я ще
FOPAR.
нещодавно дізнався, напевно, це вже другий
With the
проект,
figure two,
який
as I have
реалізується,
recently
власне,
learned. So probably
європейським
this
Союзом
is
в
already the
рамках
second
реформи
project that
державного
is
управління в
implemented
Україні.
by the EU to support the reform
Отже,
of public governance in
зараз я
Ukraine.
передаю слово колегам.
So let me give the floor to
Спочатку
my
це буде
colleagues.
Яна Охріменко, наша
First,
старша
this is going to be
економістка,
Jana
керівниця
Ohrimenko,
напрямку
our
європейської
senior
інтеграції
economist, head of the Department
в
of EU
СЕС. Потім Богдан
Integration, of the
Слуцький,
line of
економіст
activity,
СЕС, який
European
веде
integration. Then Bogdan Slutsky,
напрямок
economist of the Center for Economic
підтвердження цифр
Strategies, that
забезпечення
deals mostly
насамперед
with
доходів,
budget
але
policies, primarily
загалом
from the
тут
point of view
приєднався
of
до
revenues.
команди,
But he's
власне,
joined
щоб
our
допомогти
team
детальніше дослідити цю тему,
to
і
help
закінчить,
us
власне,
study this
Олександра
topic
Міроненко,
in detail. And then
яка,
there will
крім
come
того, що
Alexandra
економістка СЕС,
Moronenko.
власне,
She's an economist
відповідала за
of
це
our center,
дослідження.
and she's been responsible for
Це
this research.
таке, напевно, найбільше зараз
So
дослідження, яке
I guess
Саша
that this
самостійно
is the
провела.
largest
Крім того, що
research that
нещодавно перемогла
Alexandra has
як
conducted
капітанка команди
on
в
her
конкурсі
own, and
Національного банку
she has
України.
recently won at the
І цим
competition
ще
of the
раз
National Bank of
підтвердила, що
Ukraine
сюди
as the team
працюють
leader,
найкращі
thus
економісти,
confirming
найкращі
that
молоді
our
економісти
center
в
has
Україні.
the best young
Отже,
economists of
переходимо,
Ukraine on our
власне,
list
до
of staff members.
змісту.
So let's go
Яно,
over to the
прошу тебе,
presentations, and Yana,
починай, будь
over to
ласенька,
you.
share
Please
презентацію,
start,
будемо
share the
обговорювати.
presentation, and we
Дякую,
will be
Гліба.
listening attentively. Thank you,
Будь
Gleb.
ласка,
Please do confirm that you can see my presentation. Yes, everything is fine. Thank you. So we will start with the general European framework. And here I primarily need to mention that alignment of strategic objectives and the budget are a jurisdiction of every single EU member state. The EU doesn't have any centralized regulation or directive that would envisage having this alignment, but there are several mechanisms that prevent development of the strategy with no financial background. Primarily, here I'm talking about the funding coming from the EU funds, which is quite considerable. And if a strategy presupposes funding from some shared EU funds, this means that it is required to set specific indicators, to have a clear logic of the objectives, and to analyze the level of funding and the mechanisms for funding specific activities. Also, there are sectors that are within direct competence of the EU. We will consider them in detail. But all in all, if we are talking about the agri sector or the environmental protection, so there are documents that make it binding for every member state to provide detailed information on how strategic activities are going to be implemented, and there is also an economic mechanism for economic governance, and according to the new rules the member states have to submit their fiscal and structural plans, which serve as a bridge between strategies and the budget expenditure. But I have to mention that this is a rather recent mechanism. So let's consider each of those aspects in greater detail. So first of all, there is a Common Provisions Regulation, CPR. This is the regulation which sets the obligatory programming logic. Suppose a program wants to get some funding from the EU funds. The strategic objectives of this program need to be well aligned with the expenditure, which is a much more comprehensive mechanism, in fact, but here I'm just trying to describe how certain activities are going to be funded. So in every single case, the European Commission assesses whether the program complies with the general EU priorities, and the expenditure to be covered by the EU funds must have a clearly defined co-funding from national sources. No documents without any financial background are approved, even if the strategic logic is there. Secondly, if we are talking about the competences of the EU. So we have the secondary law of the EU, which makes it binding for the member states to prepare national plans, which have to include the description of the sources of funding. And here we are talking about energy and climate in particular, because every member state, while preparing an investment plan, has to indicate how this is going to be funded. Of course, we also have the common agrarian policy of the EU, where the level of expenditure is very high. That's why the requirements to the funding are also strict. And finally, if we're talking about Natura 2000, this is a nature protection network in the EU. So here the information is a little bit less detailed, but nevertheless, under Directive 92/43, member states have to prioritize action plans and indicate possible sources of funding. And we are also going over to the innovation in the EU, which is very recent, just from the last year. So it's probably too early to say how well it works, but nevertheless, we will have to be getting ready for it. So if we talk about the medium-term fiscal structural plans, so these plans include the description of the priority reforms and investment required for the implementation and attainment of the shared goals of the EU, assessment of the impact on the fiscal indicators. Also, such plans need to include projections of budget revenues and expenses for at least 4 years with a clear linkage to the strategic objectives, and they need to be well coordinated with national programs as well as EU mechanisms, including all possible strategy like energy, climate, social, defense strategies, and recovery plans. As already mentioned, this should serve as a specific bridge between strategic documents and the budget, which means that the member states have not just to describe their strategic objectives, but describe how they're going to find money for attainment of those objectives. But again, since that is a relatively recent mechanism, we will be watching how it goes, and we will be learning how to introduce this in Ukraine. Thanks a lot. That has been all for my part, and let me give the floor to my colleague Bogdan.
Всіх вітаю, всіх вітаю. Так, зараз
Welcome to
поговоримо
everyone.
дуже коротко про Нову Зеландію.
Now we're going to briefly speak about New Zealand.
Тому що чому вибрали Нову Зеландію?
We have chosen New Zealand, and we start with New Zealand while talking about specific countries because New Zealand, which is not a secret for anyone, in this topic is a kind of a benchmark to be followed, and that's what Ukraine and many other countries should be striving for. Many of them do so, but at a certain stage they fail to, that it is impossible to move at a pace with which New Zealand was doing that in terms of strategic planning, be it mid-term, long-term or short-term process with the budget for every year that is approved. What is so much unique about New Zealand? The whole point is that it is one of the few countries having a long-term forecast for 40 years. So it's not just a strategic plan for 40 years, it's a rather detailed model regarding the state debt and productivity and healthcare. And based on those 40-year forecasts that they update every 4 years, they build mid-term guidelines for 5 to 10 years, depending on the domain where the planning is taking place. That could be the target trajectory of the debt, deficit, and the principles for budget approval. Annual budget only makes the priorities more detailed without creating any new directions, new programs. So it clearly moves in accordance with the long-term and short-term forecast. The unique feature also is that suppose you enter the website of the Treasury, which is the Ministry of Finance, but it's just called Treasury in New Zealand. So you can find very detailed information there with all Excel files, data sets. So you can work with data. Data is in open access. And these are the models which are really of high quality. They can be evaluated, and then they are well adjusted both to the public in general, giving the basic summary, and it also works well for some professionals who want to understand why is this indicator, why is this conclusion has been made. So it's a very good tool for researchers. As far as midterm guidelines are concerned, so they are used as a framework assessment and evaluation of each budget. And starting with 2019, they went even further by introducing the budget, which is based not on what they want to achieve, but how and why what they try to achieve this. Let's say they set 6 well-being priorities, and based on that, they form the budget, and by this, they want to achieve growth. So it's not that at the expense of growth, they're improving well-being, but it is at the expense of, or by way of improving well-being, that they ensure growth, which is rather specific since in the conditions of scarce resources, this is not an easy thing to do. Of course, we are talking about the country which is not at war and which can afford having forecasts for 40 years, and these models will work. But anyway, they need to be updated and revised quite often. So it's quite an idealized sample. Well, we should be cautious about it since we have very different conditions. Next slide, please.
Так, і як приклад, я, щоб не забирати час, приведу
Not to take too much of your time, let me give some of the examples to show what their logic is. Suppose if we're talking about the latest assessment of 2025, we can say that their modeling of the state debt makes an assessment that now they have 43% of the state debt, and they assess that the state debt will increase to 200% of GDP by the year 2065 if they don't change any fiscal policy, but if they keep raising social standards. So they know already 40 years ahead that something needs to be changed now if they don't want to have the state debt at the level of 200 percent, which means that they either have to grow quicker or they should slow down the social benefits policy. So it's rather precious if you know ahead of time what you need to do, and you don't think in electoral or constituency voting cycles, but they think in different terms, and therefore they are not sharing the burden with the generations to come. Thank you.
Так, і перейдемо до
Yes, and let me
прикладу
go over it to the example
Латвії.
of
Отже, я
Latvia.
сподіваюся, ви бачите мій екран,
I
так?
hope you can see my
Так,
screen.
все добре.
Yes, everything is
Так,
fine.
чудово.
Great.
Отже, як Латвія узгоджує
So,
стратегічне
how
та
does
бюджетне
Latvia
планування?
align
Стратегічне
strategic
планування
and
в
budget
Латвії
planning?
базується
Strategic
на
planning in
законі
Latvia
про
is based on the
розвиток
law
системи планування,
and the
який
development of the
встановлює
planning
три
system, which
рівні
sets three
стратегічних документів.
levels of
Перший
strategic
довгостроковий,
documents. The
на
first
довгостроковий
is a
період до
long-term one,
25 років. Наразі це стратегія сталого
for the
розвитку
period of
Латвії до
25 years.
30-го
So,
року.
Latvia so
Наступний
far
рівень
has
це
the Sustainable Development
середньостроковий до
Strategy
7
until
років, і
2030.
наразі він
Then
реалізується через
midterm
Національний
is for
план
7
розвитку на
years, and now they have the
21-27 роки.
National
І
Development Plan for the
також
years
третій
2021-2027.
довгостроковий документ, який
And the
планується на
third type
період
is
до 3
short-term
років.
documents for the
Що
period and up to
стосується
3 years.
узгодження цих
If
стратегічних
we speak
документів
about the
із
alignment of those
фінансуванням, то
strategic documents
довгострокові
with
стратегічні документи не
funding, so
передбачають конкретних
long-term
сум фінансування,
documents
а
do not include any
середньострокові, зокрема
amounts,
навіть
while
національний план
midterm
розвитку,
documents,
вони
this
задають
National
орієнтовні
Development
суми
Plan
фінансування
sets
та джерела
indicative amounts of
покриття
funding and the
цих
sources of coverage
потреб.
of this
Що стосується
expenditure to
короткострокових
meet those
документів,
needs.
то
As far
вони
as short-term documents are concerned,
узгоджуються
so
в
they are
період
aligned
щорічного бюджетного процесу.
in the period of the
Для
budgeting
ефективного
process, which
узгодження
is
цього
annual.
бюджетного та
To
стратегічного
efficiently
планування
align
в
strategic
Латвії
and budget
створили
planning,
Національну
Latvia
раду
has
з питань
created the
розвитку,
National
яка якраз таки
Development Board,
забезпечує цей
which
зв'язок між стратегією та
ensures
бюджетом.
this connection between the strategy and the budget.
В Латвії був
Also,
затверджений віце-прем'єр-міністр
in
з
Latvia, they have
планування,
a vice
який
prime
бере
minister on
участь
planning
у
matters
бюджетному
who
процесі
participates in the budgeting
і
process
гарантує цю фіскальну відповідність
and
до
guarantees
стратегічних
this
пріоритетів.
fiscal compliance with
Отже, головна
strategic
особливість
priorities. The
стратегічного
main
планування в
peculiarity of
Латвії є
strategic planning in Latvia
політична
is actually
природа механізму
political
стратегічного
nature of the
планування. У
mechanism
Латвії
of
стратегічний
strategic
документ
planning. They have a
відображає
strategic
намір, а не
document
примус,
which
і цей намір
affects,
береться до
although the
уваги
strategic
владою під
documents
час
reflect intentions
планування
and not
оперативних
coercion or
цілей та
compulsory
заходів,
nature.
і
And that's why
відповідні
those documents are
заходи
taken into
не
account by the
мають бути
ministries
чітко
in the
виконані,
planning
вони
process.
можуть бути
And it's
подовжені,
not that all the
перенесені
activities
або
have to be
видозмінені за
implemented
потреби,
within the
щоб
time set. They
відповідати
can be changed,
поточним
they can be postponed
зовнішнім умовам
to
та
comply with the current
найбільш
conditions,
ефективного
external conditions in
досягнення
particular, and
стратегічної
they are
цілі.
aimed at better
Отже,
attainment of
перейдемо
strategic
до прикладу
objectives.
Польщі і
Now
невеличкий
let's take the
спойлер
example of
за
Poland, and here
нашим
is a short spoiler
аналізом.
because according to
Польща
our
є
analysis,
найкращим
Poland
прикладом
is the
для
best
наслідування в
example
Україні,
to
оскільки в
follow for
Польщі
Ukraine,
існує доволі
since in
розвинута
Poland
система
we have
стратегічного
quite a
планування,
well-developed strategic
яка після
planning
вступу
system.
Польщі до ЄС
After
функціонує
Poland
за
joined
нормами
the
та умовами
EU,
єС,
it
а до
follows the
вступу
norms and
Польщі до
requirements of the
ЄС
EU. But before
стратегічне
that,
планування базувалося
strategic
і
planning in
концентрувалося
Poland
на
was
виконанні умов
focused and
для
based on
вступу в рамках
compliance with the
політики
terms
визнання.
for accession of the EU
Що
within the
стосується
approximation
загальної системи,
policy.
то в Польщі вона
As
також
far as
є
the overall system
провідною,
is
як можна
concerned, it's
побачити на
also a
слайді, і
three-tiered system in
основні
Poland, as you can see it in the
риси
slide, and the
стратегічного планування
basic
відображені
characteristics
в
of the
законі про
strategic planning
проведення
system are
політики
reflected in the
розвитку.
law on the
Отже,
development
давайте
policy
подивимося на цей процес
implementation. So
стратегічного
let's have a look
планування
at
в
this
Польщі.
process of
І
strategic planning in Poland.
високорівневою
Um,
стратегією розвитку вони
you can see that
розробляють
there is a
щорічно,
high-level
раз
development
на 7
strategy, which
років,
is developed at
та
least
вони
once in 7
повинні
years.
встановити пріоритети,
And
цілі
the
та систему
strategy should
реалізації
contain the priorities,
цієї
objectives, and the implementation system
стратегії.
for this
Проте закони
strategy.
Польщі не
But the
визначаються, не
law, the
вимагають
legislation
визначення
in
конкретних
Poland does not
обсягів
require
фінансування для
identification of
реалізації
specific
цієї
amounts of
стратегії.
funding for the
Вони
implementation of the strategy,
визначаються на рівень
because
нижче в
these amounts are
операційних
indicated a
програмах
level
на
lower
національному
in
та
operational
регіональному
programs,
рівні,
which could be
які
national and
які
regional ones. And these operational
виготовляються на
programs
виконання
are
цієї
developed
стратегії.
to ensure fulfillment of the strategy. In
складовою
particular, it is
операційних
envisaged
програм
that a
є
component of those operational programs is a financial plan, or rather financial plans, which reflect the sources of funding for the implementation of the program, specific amounts of money, the allocation of the money in between priorities, as well as co-funding, which means the share of the state, the share of the region, and the share to be paid by the EU funds. The next level is the voivodeship or district contract, which sets the funding between allocation funding between the state and the region, and it's actually the administration of the voivodeship together with the ministry responsible for regional development. It's concluded in partnership between them, and the government decides it further on based on the priorities which are stated in those contracts. Then those operational plans come together to form an executive plan which details the amounts of money and the allocation of money. And the amount of money from the state budget is approved by the Ministry of Finance. Further on, to ensure more effective implementation, there is the statement in the law of Poland that predetermines the institutional at an administrative level, setting three main roles, which is the managing institution, doing program management, then mediator institution, dealing with selection of projects and contracts with beneficiaries, and the implementing institution, which deals with project implementation in the regions. And also the law sets the reporting and accountability mechanism according to which the administration of the voivodeship on an annual basis provides information about the course of implementation of the regional operational program together with the financial indicators reflected in it. As far as the current status is concerned, so far, the funding of long-term strategic documents is provided under the country's development concept until 2050. This concept contains strategic objectives and the overall vision of Poland's development until 2050, and it also suggests several development scenarios depending on the external circumstances. This concept is a strategic basis for other strategic documents, and it does not determine any specific amounts of funding, but it includes the mechanisms of financial coordination via program and sectoral contracts. As far as midterm strategic documents are concerned, so far in Poland, they develop Poland's development strategy. It does not indicate any clear amounts, but it sets certain approaches showing that funding of specific events suggested or activities suggested by the strategy is budgeted in the annual budget, and the strategy also presupposes having some specific preconditions, let's say defense costs that should be at least 3% of GDP, and healthcare costs should be at least 7% of GDP in 2027, starting with 2027, and it also contains some other requirements. The strategy also determines the directions of expenditure of the European money and has the list of other sources of funding. As far as short strategic documents are concerned, they are funded within an annual budgeting process. And let's go over to our recommendations for Ukraine. So our main recommendation for Ukraine to effectively align strategic and budget planning is maximum integration of the European norms and standards, because that will affect not just the system of strategic planning in Ukraine, but it will also reinforce our EU integration intentions. We need to fully implement common provisions, regulations, Jana has mentioned, to secure a sufficient legislative framework for sectoral and regional strategies. And following the example of Poland, we need to adopt the law that would set clear rules of strategic planning in Ukraine, and it should contain such key elements as the structure of strategic documents that will show the logical connection, which is really important between the strategy, programs, and their funding. Also, this law has to set institutional roles following the example of Poland. We should have the managing, mediatory, and implementing institutions. It should reflect the connection with the budget process and speak on the perennial planning and co-funding. We also need to ensure regular updating of this law following the updated common provisions regulation to ensure compliance with the current EU terms. And the second recommendation, coming already from the example of Latvia, is that we should give a sudden mandate to a body or a top official to participate in the process of state budget planning by securing the correspondence of the fiscal policy with the strategic development objectives. That's all for me. Thank you for attention.
Сашо, дякую.
Thank you.
Ти не дала, і я не
So,
додивився конкретної
you have
відсотку
not
від цих
uh,
233
indicated
хоча
the
я його десь
specific
бачив,
percentage of
який
those
на
333
забезпечення фінансування,
strategies
скільки там було?
that are provided with funding. I can tell it, actually 6
6%
of them do
стратегій,
have
наскільки
funding. So
забезпечено
6%
фінансування.
of our
Ми
strategies do have
не
funding.
сфокусувалися особливо
We somehow didn't focus on this
тому,
figure,
щоб
and we also
довести
didn't
тим, хто
focus
сьогодні
on proving
завітав на наш захід,
those
що
who
ця
have come to
проблема
our
існує,
today's
напевно,
event
тому
that this problem
що
exists
ми виходимо
mainly
з загального
because
розуміння, що вона є,
we
і більше
just
зосередилися, власне, на тому, як
don't
можна
know
з
that this problem exists, and we
цієї
have rather
неоптимальної
focused on
ситуації виходити.
how we could find a way
Огіс,
out or a possible solution
які
from this
є твої
situation. So, August,
враження?
what is your
Дякую за твою
impression?
допомогу,
Thank you for
зокрема,
your
по досвіду
assistance.
Латвії
Thank you
та
for
її
your
рідної
help, in
країни.
particular when we
Нам
were
також
analyzing the
теж
experience of Latvia,
краще в
because
цьому
this is
досвіді
your native country and you
розібратися,
helped us to better scrutinize this
слідкуєш не тільки за
experience.
тим, що
So
відбувається в
I know
Україні,
that you are
тому що
following not only
відбувається
what is
в
happening in
в
Ukraine,
інших
you're also
країнах
following what is
членів
happening in other
Європейського
countries,
Союзу,
new
які,
member
власне,
states of the
намагаються
EU
після
that are also trying
комуністичної системи
after the
переходити на кращу
communist
практику
system to
стратегічного
go over to the
планування.
best practices of
Україна, на
strategic
жаль,
planning.
не є
Ukraine,
хорошим
unfortunately,
зразком. Тут,
is not a good
очевидно,
example to follow in this
стратегічне
respect.
планування завжди
A
було
strategic
проблемою
planning
в
in
Україні,
Ukraine has
тому що
always been a
історично
problem
стратегії
because it's how historically
під
happened
час
that
Радянського
strategies
Союзу вироблялися в
in the
Москві, а в
Soviet
Україні
times were
лише
developed in
виконувалися.
Moscow, and in
Системи
Ukraine they were just to be
хорошої не
implemented
було,
by a good
і,
by
власне,
our
зараз
system.
ми
We didn't have a good
намагаємося,
system for
зокрема, шляхом
strategic
європейської
planning. So now
інтеграції
on our way towards the European integration, we are trying
впровадити
to
модель,
change
яка
something about
буде
that and
більш
introduce a model
більш
that would be
довгостроково
more
зроблена.
long-term
Які
and
твої
more
враження,
aligned.
який
So what are
досвід
your
краще
impressions? What is your
використовувати,
experience
що
what
є
experience should be
найважливішим,
used?
і
What
як
things
це
are
може
probably the most
накластися
important, and how
на систему
could
державного
this
управління, з якою
be
ти вже
connected with this
протягом
public
багатьох років
administration
працюєш
system
в
with
Україні?
which you have been
Прошу.
working in Ukraine for many years? You're welcome.
Дякую, Глібе. Дякую
Thank you,
колегам
Gleb.
з
Thank you,
центру за
colleagues.
запрошення.
Thank you a
Особисто
lot, dear
Олександру
colleagues from the
Богдану
center,
за
for
цю презентацію.
the invitation. Thank you, Alexander
Цього
Rodanyana,
цікаво.
for
Я
the
якось
presentation with a
побаюсь
lot of
цього
things.
цієї
I'm a little
початкової
bit
назви Гліб-рецензент.
afraid of this title, a
Я
reviewer,
спробую
but I will
дати
try
свої
to
коментарі
actually provide my
в цьому
comments and
стилі, так?
impressions.
Я
on
трошки
this.
зранку думав про
In the
те,
morning,
як я
I was
можу
thinking a little bit on
додатись до цієї
what,
дискусії.
how I could be prepared,
І
how I
я
could
придумав,
be
що
getting
я
ready for this discussion. And
хочу
I've actually
говорити про,
thought
скажімо
that
так,
I would like to speak
3 виклики,
about the challenges,
які має ця тема
the
стратегічного
challenges
планування та
that we are
бюджетування.
faced with within this
І,
topic of
в принципі,
strategic
це
and
ці
budget
виклики є
planning.
також
And I would
моїми
say
дуже
that
загальними
those
коментарями
challenges
колегам
would come as my general
від уряду, які
comments
працюють над урядовою
for
стратегією
the colleagues from the
стратегічного
government who are
планування.
working
Я
on
знаю,
the
що недавно така
strategic
була
planning, on the
затверджена,
government's planning strategy. Or
і тут
as
я
far as I understand,
повинен
some
зробити
strategy has recently
дисклеймер,
been
так?
adopted. And let me make a
В цій дискусії
disclaimer, because in this discussion,
biased,
I'm a little bit
тому
biased
що я
since
починав свою кар'єру
I
держслужбовця
started my career
в моїй країні, в Латвії.
being a civil servant in Latvia,
людьми, які починали в
and
нашому уряді цю
we
тематику.
were the people who
Я був
started
великим
this,
прихильником
working with this topic in our government, and I was a great supporter and proponent of this topic. But with time,
в мене
I became more skeptical
вирос, так?
about
Це
that
одне. І по-друге,
all.
другий
This is
дисклеймер.
one thing. And the second disclaimer
І це
is
моє
that
навчання після того, я вже працюю в інших
um,
країнах.
after that, I've been working in a number of other countries, and
Do not try
I
it at
always
home.
say,
Так.
do not try it at
Тому
home,
що іноземний досвід,
because
він
foreign
завжди
experience
виглядає
is always the one that
привабливим на бумазі, а
looks
насправді
nice
там дуже
and attractive, but in fact, there are a lot of tricky things, cultural nuances and subtleties behind it, due to which this experience can really work only in that country. These are the three things that I wanted to mention at the beginning. And sorry, this Ukrainian is not my native language. That's why I've taken too much of your time. No, it's perfect. Thank you. So the first thing I would like to mention today is as follows. We should speak about the clarity of terms and notions and the noise around us in the background. I think that if we have a discussion on strategic planning and budgeting in the context of their alignment, we need to clearly understand how we define all those terms and concepts. When I hear strategic planning and budgeting as names or notions used in the title of the discussion, it seems to me that there may be a lot of noise in the background regarding these notions. And by background noise, I mean things like our biases and prejudices regarding this or that theory of strategic planning or budgeting. Suppose the rational thinking model and planning is just one of the schools that may be engaged in this large discussion, but I can see that in civil service, this model is quite often prevailing, and our interpretation is, as well as our today's discussion, is mainly based on that school, though it's not the only one. The second example of the background noise is when, suppose, we are fascinated with some models and tools that we can see in other countries, and we make an assumption that they work so efficiently there in those countries, and then they can easily be copy-pasted in the background, in the territory of another country. But that's just an assumption. And whenever I try to remove all those background noise elements from my thinking in order to develop my own definition of strategic planning, I find it difficult to do it. Well, for me, it's not difficult, but it may be difficult for other people. So it all depends on how good the decisions that we now make are. If these are decisions about changes in policies or changes in the budget. So by how good, I mean is how those decisions and desirable deliverables correspond to what we later get as outcomes. In this context, we should also understand that strategic planning in the public administration sector goes back to this rational school of thinking, while budgeting by its nature and in practice is incremental. Budgeting is based on the inertia of the previous decisions. And in fact, all those changes in financing in the context of the documents mentioned in Latvia or in Poland, well, this is just a small part, and this refers only to a small share of budget resources. It was like 3 or 7% of GDP, not quite a lot.
І всі ці рішення
And all those decisions
часто визначаються
about financing are quite often predetermined not just by some rational policy and rational thinking, but sometimes by open populism and political compromise as well, which is an important thing to bear in mind, since in this respect, strategic planning should work in the environment, in the space where, on the one hand, we have this rational top-down planning coming, but there is also this bottom-to-top incremental and highly inertial system of budgeting. So within this space, the main question in practice will always be what is the share of short-term, quite often populistic decisions, and how much this can influence really what will happen in the future based on data. So in this regards, I have to tell that for me, more important strategic planning tools are not all those documents that countries show as the architecture of the strategic planning system. I think that more important are the documents that create a little bit different culture, the culture of policy wording based on evidence, the use of data. It's also about the culture that gives enough time and allows to have discussions in different policy contexts. This is also about critical thinking. The documents that develop this readiness to call into question the business as usual approach. Also, readiness to identify mistakes and to learn some lessons based on those mistakes. I think that all those things really contribute to strategic thinking and planning much more than all those systems of documents that look so nice in many countries. And by the way, here, when we also try to think the way it is organized in our system with soft things. And I think that if we lack those cultural elements in Ukraine, and we just think that changes could be introduced through documents or through a package of documents, which looks rather logical, we will only appear to be in a situation when we will have just one method of budgeting. Let's perform an appraisal method in civil service. Well, this is a good tool, but in practice, it gives us not the result that was expected to be our deliverable. And it's not because it's a bad tool. It's because we're using this tool not effectively, because this tool doesn't have a cultural background to rely on. This is my first comment. My second comment is about red tape and the role of bureaucracy in this whole process. Bureaucrats are the people I love greatly, in inverted commas. That's why I can actually try to be even provocative when speaking about this topic. I hope that many of you remember when Ronald Reagan was talking about bureaucrats, and he said that, well, I will try to quote, the worst, the most scary 9 words in English language are, I've come to help you. I'm Mrs. Zoe, I've come to help you. Well, definitely this is a highly ideological statement with a lot of over-exaggeration, but I just wanted to use it to stress one thing.
насторожитися, коли бюрократія каже,
We have to be cautious when bureaucrats claim that we have come here to help you. We will embrace the future through documents, and then the whole process will be brought down to just amending those documents and updating them. So when there is a lot of too much bureaucracy in those documents, and when there is a document-centered approach to the future, that is always a risk. When there is too much bureaucracy, we tend to be document-centered and apply a document-centered approach, which is the wrong one. And whenever I see this, I'm telling that this is the beginning of the end to this system. And your figures 333 actually shows us that this system is too much document focused. There is too much control in this system, while on the contrary, there is less strategic thinking and strategic conversation. So in this regards, if we have a look at the OECD countries, that is often brought to our attention as a sample of innovations in this regards, we have to also notice that this document-centered strategic planning system is being replaced with a system focusing on different foresights, future concepts, stakeholder consultations, and a lot of other events that create a lot of points in time where we can reconsider our incremental thinking in the budgetary process. And my last, third comment that I would like to share with you is about capacity. It's about culture and space. It's probably the most practical out of the three comments of mine. I think that capacity quite often is the main limitation in any new system that we would like to introduce and build. The point is that capacity is not just about knowledge and skills, it's also about the culture, legal culture, on which the whole system is based. So that's what I may also call a political space or demand for a new system. I would even say that the combination of capacity, culture, and the space mentioned by me is not a stable combination in any system. It's changing together with other aspects and with the new generations of civil servants. We can see it from the example of Latvia. In this case study that you presented, it at least looks, well, it looks as one system on paper, but this system actually started with scenario A, but now it's following a different scenario, absolutely different. So in terms of the architecture of documents, it looks one and the same system. And I think that before we restructure or rebuild the planning and budgeting system, let's call it strategic planning and budgeting system, we need to be absolutely sure that basic things in the planning and the budgeting processes really work well. And only after that, we may start building some things that look better, appear to be better. Because for me, basic things are the most important. And basic things are about, well, I don't know how I can call this in Ukrainian. In English, we call it baseline planning and budgeting. So we need to understand what our baseline steps are going to be, what our baseline scenario, no policy change scenario is going to be, because we need to understand what fiscal space we have got. And if we don't have this fiscal space, then what can we do? This is also about assessment of the cost of not documents and strategies, but of laws. We which is probably
Ми самі можемо
not that easy to
оцінити,
assess.
наскільки
We
ми це
can
робимо
actually
зараз, так?
have an impression of how
Це
well
також
we are doing
про
this now.
який там простір в
This is
щорічному
also a
бюджетному
certain
процесі, коли
space
політики
in
і
the annual budgeting
стейкхолдери можуть
process where
збиратися і говорити про
other
різні пропозиції
stakeholders may get
newcomer
together and
policies і
offer some
сподіваюся,
options, some new
off the
policies,
record
discuss all this off the record, not formally.
trade-offs між цими рішеннями.
So
Це також,
this is done in
на
between
мой погляд,
the decisions
офіційно
passed.
затверджена
I also
програма
think that
діяльності уряду. Так.
the official
Яка є базовою
governmental action
речі.
plan
Це
or
дуже базові
program,
речі. Якщо
this
вони
is also a
працюють, я
basic thing
впевнений,
that needs to be
що
there. And if these basic things really work well, I'm sure that the budget will be more strategic
орієнтованим на майбутнє,
and will be focusing and orient
і в
towards the
ситуаціях,
future.
коли у нас там
And in
наприклад,
situations when
настройки
we
надбудови документів. Так.
don't have, and then we will have a situation
І
where we
така
don't have the superstructure in the form of
думка в
extra
контексті
documents. And my
досвіду
final
України. Я переконаний, що
conclusion in the context of the experience of Ukraine is as follows. I'm sure that Ukraine really needs
управління, так. Це не тільки в
a
контексті
strategic
Європейського
planning
Союзу,
framework, not just in the context of the requirements coming from the EU in the period of integration. Ukraine really needs that framework
виходить за межі там
that would go beyond
бюджетної декларації.
the 3-year budget declaration in one government action program. This should be a framework with a more general contour, which is clear. Of course, we have war, we have capacity issue, we have the problem of recovery and reconstruction and European integration, and capacity also comes through the prism of that. The war is the key factor here, which actually affects all the other lines of activity. So the main question here is what document or system of documents could really help us create some consensus between stakeholders regarding the future vector of Ukraine's movement. And another question is how this vector should be reflected in budget-based or budget-related decisions. And it seems to me that we need to have an open and frank talk, looking back at all the attempts that have already been made to develop some super plans that Ukraine already made, or that Ukraine has already created. And we need to ask a very simple question: which things in this experience really worked well? What are the lessons learned? And what steps are we ready to take to create the system of the future? And that will be the system of strategic planning made in Ukraine. It will not just be a copy-pasting practice. This will be the real brand made in Ukraine. Thank you. I hope I have been a little bit provocative. Thank you, August. I can see that there is a comment, and Dmytro Shevchuk has already been added, so I'll give the floor to him. But August, here is one clarification, if I may. You have mentioned that on paper we used to have the same system in Latvia, but actually there is scenario A and scenario B. So the practical implementation of the system is different. So how did it come about? Where was this turning point if on paper the same was left and seemingly nothing special was happening in Latvia? They didn't have any Maidans, any drastic political changes. How did the country manage to grow in this respect in terms of strategic planning and budgeting? Well, I wouldn't be head of this EU project if I was not saying something about public administration and civil service. and if I wouldn't be praising it. So thank you for the question. Let me try to explain what I meant by saying this. In fact, when the National Development Plan appeared, this was it was based on a very powerful process that included many stakeholders and, in fact, really helped us reach a consensus regarding what our objective is and where we are moving. So everybody understood that this is the general framework to which we will be adjusting all our strategies, plans, and activities in general, as well as budget priorities. But since political generations were changing, generations of civil servants were changing, so, every single plan runs the risk of becoming more of a document than a consensus-based action plan. So this is because of the bureaucracy, and this is a great risk because we sometimes want to do something formally, and definitely then it's not a consensual and strategic document. I think that the system changed a little bit from the point of view of how all this strategic matrix actually affects the decisions that are passed in every budget process. So you mean that the scheme on paper also influences people the way people influence the schemes that exist on paper? Yes. And that was my second comment about the role of bureaucrats and the way they use tools, because bureaucrats always have a lot of incentives to close control mechanisms, and that is the end of the strategic thinking. Thank you. I can see there is a hand raised. This is Dmytro Shevchuk, who is deputy head of the state auditors service, but I think that Dmytro is going to ask a question or to make a comment. As the head of the directorate for the coordination of state policies and strategic planning of the Secretariat of the Cabinet of Ministers, where he used to work with them, and he worked with this topic. So, Dmytro, you're very much welcome. Hello and thank you. Thank you for your research, but I've got some feedback because once in 4 or 5 years, our country goes back to inventing a system which is either needed or already exists, but we are reinventing it. 30 years ago, while adopting the Constitution, we introduced there some articles which already developed the framework for strategic planning. This is Article 95, paragraph 5, saying that the Verkhovna Rada sets the principles of internal and external policy. So the creators of the Constitution already wanted the strategy of the development of the country to be those principles of external and internal policies. We have law of the year 2010, which is not quite popular, but it's also not quite often amended, and this law predetermines what we need to do in this respect. I think that it needs to be said that before the Constitution, after the adoption of the Constitution, the Verkhovna Rada also passed some laws on the principles of policies in different spheres, which constitute either a constitutionally stated framework for the strategic planning. Let's say we have a law of 1993 that said what we need to do with the, let's say, budgetary process. So the strategic framework seems to be already there. The same article in 89 contains paragraph 6 that says that the parliament sets the general state programs. And then Article 116, paragraph 4 says that the Cabinet of Ministers elaborates the general state programs that would further be assigned as state target programs. So there are some target programs adopted by the cabinet, but there are also some documents that have to be approved by the parliament further on. So when we raise the issue of creation of the system of strategic planning, at some point in time, we have to understand that about the constitutional contour, which already sets the nature of those programs, we create the new essence, which is strategies. We already have the constitutional contour, whether there are three circles, the president, the parliament, and the cabinet of ministers as the system of executive authorities. And, well, there is some ambiguity regarding whose documents are more important, because the cabinet of ministers is guided by the decisions of the president and the parliament, but it's not quite clear whose decision is more important. And the president, according to the constitution, is also the one who sets the issues related to diplomatic policy, defense policy. So there will be a question, can the cabinet of ministers really decide something in terms of external diplomacy or military and defense area? Also, Article 140 of the Constitution sets that the state does not interfere into local self-government. So we still also have this local self-government, which is included into this national circle of stakeholders. So while adopting the law on solving the issues of strategic planning, we need to understand whether the cabinet of ministers will be interfering into local budgets or no, or local communities will be passing their decisions on their own, because the Constitution of the year 1996 entitles them to this, and the reform on decentralization from April 2014 also says about the same. So creating a new system of strategic planning, we did nothing to the old one that already existed there. In some decisions, the Constitutional Court said that while adopting laws, the lawmaker has to also not create new content, new meaning, but disclose the issues mentioned in the Constitution. And the lawmaker says that the program of the Cabinet of Ministers is the key strategy for its activities. So here I'm back with what I started. Once in 4 or 5 years, we try to imagine a new system of strategic planning without understanding that we already have some systems. Let's try to update the system which we have now, and we will see whether culture will eat the strategy for breakfast or not, as noticed in the chat. Let's restore the law on the principles of external and internal policy, and let's try to set the timeline for this law, because it's now for an indefinite period of time. Let's mention in this law that there are specific directions of activity where we should have specific documents. Let's be more specific about that. And it's only state target programs that are related to budgetary planning and not the orders of the government. So let's decide what the status of the Council of National Defense and Council is, what the president's orders are, what their status is. I think that we should not have any excessive contours with no additional meeting, because this would just lead to more confusion. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm afraid that culture is very slim and lean with us, because or probably strategies are not well fed. That's why when culture tries to eat the strategy for breakfast, culture always stays hungry. Yes, the point is that culture may look like this. Before setting new tasks, let's accomplish the ones that we have said before. In 2014 and then in 2016, the government adopted the moratorium for the approval of target state programs. So let's have a revision of the ones that we have. Let's cancel most of them. Let's revise what can be done and update them. Let's connect them to the budget programs. Let's connect the passports for the programs and the indicators of those strategies. And then we will have 2 or 3 budget cycles, and let's see, maybe it will work. Fine. So the idea behind all this is that there should be a strategic guillotine. Yes, but in the year 2019, there was an attempt to also create a government committee related to strategic planning. So if the government cannot do it through some YouTube discussion platforms, well, that may also be arranged. If a certain politician wants to pass 2 or 3 strategies to stay in the history of Ukraine, so I don't think that this is an important thing that we should allow them to do. There should be a certain platform or a certain committee affiliated to the Cabinet of Ministers to discuss all those strategies, to discuss whether we need 333 of them. So we have something that already exists, so why should we invent something new? So it's a good idea. Metro has reminded us that we really already had a government committee that was considering strategic issues. That already happened in our history. And that's actually the mechanism mechanism that is available or could be available. Normally, the head of this committee is the vice prime minister or maybe the prime minister, if I'm not mistaken. And the profile of vice prime minister could also be an option for being ahead of that committee. Thanks a lot to all those who have participated in our discussion. As you have understood, this is just our first approach, our first attempt to analyze international experience and to have a look at this problem in Ukraine. Thanks a lot to Ugis and Metro for adding some remarks and comments. This is something related to regional vision and to Ukrainian experience of previous uh, approaches in this area. I think that we need to be getting ready for the end of the war, because after the end of the war, we'll have to go back to the striving to introduce some long-term visions and long-term pictures, deliverables that we would like to see, the pictures of future cities there which we would like to see, and we need to do it in the right way, either through the approach suggested by Metro or probably having it done through the European frame. This is also a good background that we could take as the basis. Thanks a lot, dear colleagues who have been working on this research. We will also have the presentation to the line ministries that work with this range of topics, and we will also take into account the comments voiced today. And I'm really grateful to all those who have been staying with us today, this webinar. As you have seen in the chat, you have a link to the presentation and to the report. It's available on our website. You can get acquainted with it. And suppose you have any comments, please write to us. We will be happy to take them into account. So thanks a lot to everyone and stay safe. Goodbye.
Дякуємо.